Let's take a look at what some of the science is saying. So I'm going to present some of that to you, and then I'm going to give you some really easy guidelines on our second to last slide here. I'll make it really easy so that you know what you can do in basically any situation. Hey guys, today we're going to talk about stretching and warming up for your ideal performance with running. Now this applies to racing and it applies to your training, right? I can remember all the way back to, elementary school, middle school, high school gym class where they say, make sure that you get a good stretch in so that you don't pull a muscle. And we would always start off, we'd go to gym class and we would start off with some static stretching. We'd sit down and do toe touches and do this stuff with our arms. And you know what? Even in high school and college, track and cross country, we would kind of do the same thing. It got a little bit better. I'll say better because we used to start with a warm-up, a jogging warm-up, and then we would stretch. But let's take a look at what some of the science is saying. So I'm going to present some of that to you, and then I'm going to give you some really easy guidelines so that you know what you can do in basically any situation. Now, this isn't cookie cutter. I'm going to give you the most cookie cutter that I can so that you can apply it, but then I want you to do what feels good for you. And actually, that's what the science shows, is that doing what you think is going to help you is actually what helps you. But it's not because it changes how your body works. It's because it changes how your mind works. And if that sounds confusing, don't worry. I'm going to share that research with you here. One of the pieces of research I'm going to start with is by the Journal of Exercise Rehabilitation. Now, the title of this particular study here is The Effects of Warm-Up and Stretching. Those are the things we want to look at here on the isokinetic moment of collegiate men. Okay. Now, isokinetic, you don't have to worry about this too much. There's different ways that a muscle can contract. So a real simple way to say this to you is that there's something called an isometric, and that is where you're making a contraction, but there's no movement. It's like you're pushing on a wall as hard as you can. So you're contracting, but there's no movement. That's isometric. Then there's isotonic, which means that you are moving through a range of motion as your muscle contracts, and you're moving and the resistance stays the same. So if you pick up a dumbbell and you do a dumbbell curl like that, but here's something that's interesting is that when you're running, sometimes you have some isometric, isotonic, but you have isokinetic going on. Isokinetic means that as you go through a range of motion, the resistance changes. So if you've used a elastic band for strengthening before, that's interesting because as the band gets stretched, it actually provides more resistance. So the resistance is changing as you move it. It's not always the same. So that's isokinetic. We don't have to get too much into that, but I want you to know what this study was looking at. That's the kind of contraction. And this kind of contraction is really important, especially for functional movement, for running, right? Because it has the capability to maximize the output really that your muscles can do. So if I'll say it this way, if this were a 40-pound dumbbell and I'm going to go do it's the heaviest that I can pick up and do a dumbbell curl with. I can't pick up 45 pounds, just 40. Well, that means that I'm limited by the weakest part of my muscle. When I go to pick it up, that's one of the weakest areas, right? So I'm limited by that. But in the middle range of motion, I could actually lift 60 pounds. But I can't even pick up the 60-pound dumbbell because I'm limited by that first part. Make sense? So when you use isokinetic, you can actually gauge the strength of a muscle throughout its whole range of motion. So enough on that. Let's look more into this study itself. I put the title up here again. I put the journal down on the bottom right here in case you guys wanted to look it up. But I'm going to read just a couple of select areas of some of this study for you. Okay? So the first one is performing warm-ups increases your muscular temperature and blood flow, which contributes to improved exercise performance. Okay? So we know that increasing the blood flow to our muscles is going to help with our performance. Well, I'm going to give you the exact amount of time at the very end of this, and we're not going to go that long here. I'm going to give you the exact amount of time that the research shows that you need to warm up for, okay? But let's look at a couple of other things. They looked at stretching 3 different ways. Now, they looked at subjects who did no warm-up, then subjects who did a general warm-up, just warming up, jogging, and then a warm up with stretching. And they compared the three. So I want you to take a look at the end of this here, and I'm going to make it easy and highlight it for you. So the ASW, that means aerobic warm up plus stretching warm up. That's what that stands for. A simple stretch during warm up appears to have no effect on your exercise physiology. However, they seem to have a meaningful effect on exercise performance by affording a psychological benefit during preparation. And so one of the findings of this particular study here, and they looked at other studies as well, which we're going to highlight by other authors, but what they found is that warming up helps your performance, chiefly by increasing blood flow and creating a dilation of blood flow where the working muscles are, but the stretching didn't really improve performance. And when it did, it improved it by giving a psychologic edge because you feel like you're doing something. You're getting yourself in the zone. It's more of the routine that you're doing that's getting you into the zone than the actual stretching itself. That's pretty interesting. So think about that. If you've been stretching before a workout or before a race, every time you run for your whole life, maybe for years or even decades, is pretty much anchored in there that when I'm stretching, I'm getting ready to perform. And it's part of your routine that gets you psychologically pumped and ready to go and perform. So you warm up your body and then you warm up your mind. But if you were a non-trained athlete and you didn't have this, and this is what they showed with non-trained athletes, if you did the warm up and then the stretch, you had no benefit from adding in the stretch. Now that's really important. Okay, let's move forward here. So I'm going to highlight a couple of other things. Other researchers suggest that warm-up stretching actually decreases your performance. And this isn't, when it says that researchers suggest, it doesn't mean that it's their opinion. And so right after this, you can see the actual studies, the actual names of the researchers and the publication where they did similar research that actually showed that stretching was detrimental to performance. We can talk about a couple of ways that that happens. One of the ways is that you can think of your muscle almost as an elastic band. And it's not quite an elastic band, but there is a component to your muscles that is basically elastic. Now, when you put a stretch on a muscle, it's not that it's made of rubber and so recoils, but there are these little things inside of a muscle, and they're called muscle spindles. And they're inside the muscle fibers, and they're between the muscle fibers. And when they sense a stretch like that, they don't want your body to stretch until it rips. So they actually, when there's a stretch, they provide a contraction going this way. And you don't have to think about it, and it's done automatically. And so effectively, it seems like a rubber band. You stretch, whoo, and there's a recoil. Stretch, and there's a recoil. And you want that. With your running, you want to have that recoil. Now, think for a second what it's like when you run in the soft sand at the beach. Not that hard-packed sand, but the soft sand. Or in the mud or something. It's much tougher, right? It's much tougher. And the reason is because all of that elastic recoil, that rubber bandedness that you have in your calves, for example, it gets stolen. It doesn't have an ability to rebound like a spring. It gets sunken into the ground and your elastic recoil gets stolen from you. So if you stretch, what these researchers found is that if you stretch too much, even at all, what you do is you inhibit those muscle spindles, and so you lose that ability to bounce back. And it's effectively like running in a little bit of sand. And we don't want that. That's not good for performance, right? Now, is it good for injury prevention? It depends on the injury, and it depends on what you're stretching. So let's move forward. The types of stretching techniques that they did were dynamic stretching. Now, dynamic means that you're moving through a range of motion as you're stretching. They did ballistic stretching, static stretching, and we won't go into those just for the sake of time, but what they found, I'll actually recap those at the end here. What they found was that proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, which is a fancy way of saying, you could abbreviate it as PNF. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to show you exactly what PNF stretching is. And what they found is that PNF stretching actually does have a benefit. But doing the other kinds is basically what they're showing here is actually increasing your injury risk. Now let's take a look at a summary of what this all means for you. Now, how long should you warm up? If you warmed up for 1 minute, would that have a benefit? It would. If you warmed up for an hour, would that have a benefit? It might actually. But where's the sweet spot? So what you're chiefly trying to do with your warm-up is, like we said, and like the research shows, you want to increase the blood flow. So how long does it take to increase the blood flow in a working muscle? And the answer is 7 minutes. So that tells us that anytime you add a new stimulus to your warm-up, you should do it for about 7 minutes. So that could be very progressive. It doesn't mean your whole warm-up is 7 minutes, although it could. What it means is that every time you add a new stimulus, it takes about 7 minutes to adapt to it. So let's say you wake up in the morning and you get out of bed. Just standing up is a new stimulus to your muscles. They're contracting, and so you should be standing up, walking around for at least 7 minutes. And then when you go out the door, if you haven't been walking around your house, you might want to walk for a few minutes. But then when you start jogging nice and easy to warm up, you should do it for about 7 minutes or so. And if you tried to just get into running fast, you would be able to do it, but your muscles aren't adapted yet and your performance is going to be inhibited. And we know this because if you've ever been to the track and you go to do some intervals, if you don't warm up enough, maybe you warm up just one lap or something. It's not 7 minutes. And you go to do, 8 by 400 meters. Well, that first one is probably kind of slow and probably taxing a little bit. And then your second one a little better, and your third one a little faster. And by the time you hit your fourth one, it's probably just about your fastest one, your easiest one. And fifth and sixth, and then your last one's normally fastest just because psychologically you go faster, right? But the point is, those first couple, they didn't feel as good. They weren't as fast because you weren't warmed up. Simply because you did interval number 1, 2, and 3, 3, 4, and 5 are going to be faster, easier, and more efficient. Because you spent about 7 minutes warming up. So what you can do is jog for about 7 minutes. And then instead of stretching, here's something that you can do. And that is a functional movement. So functional movement just means doing something that is similar to what you're going to do for performance. And it could actually be not the same thing, just on the peripherals, similar to it. So this might be, for running, it might be you do your 7-minute warm-up jog, and then you do some functional movement, which could be things like lunges or squats or jump squats or calf raises. Or you could do some jump rope, or you could just jump up and down and bounce. Or you could do some strides or something like that, because they're pretty functional. They actually fire your muscles in a similar way than your running is going to be. Now, the benefit here is that by doing something not exactly running, but pretty close to it, is you're not going to have to worry about taxing the muscle too much before your race. Now, you actually do want to tax the muscle a little bit the way you're going to race, but not too much, right? Obviously, because then you'll just get tired. So functional movement. And this picture of this girl here, she's having a grand old time. Look at her, smiling, laughing, and she's doing high knees, right? So she's jogging and she's lifting her knees up. And guess what? You're not going to run like that, but you run similarly to that. So she's engaging her hip flexors. She's engaging her quads. She's engaging her calf of her standing leg. She's engaging her core. And so she's warming that up. And you do things like this. You may have heard them even like plyometrics, right? Or as my coach in high school used to call them, polymetrics, which is not correct, but his intentions were good. So you can do things like this, functional movement. Now, when you do a functional movement, how long do you do it? Boom, you want to do it again for about 7 minutes. Less, it's okay. More, that's okay too. But the sweet spot is 7 minutes, and now you know why. You're increasing blood flow. You're optimizing how the nerves are firing for efficiency with a movement. And then, finally here, you want to do either no stretching or just light stretching. Now, how do you know what to stretch? Should you stretch every muscle in your body? No, because we already know that stretching even a little bit too much, and by too much, it could even mean at all, that you can have a detriment to your performance. So let's not waste any stretching on things that aren't going to matter. And I'm going to tell you that based off of a really awesome piece of research, which you guys can download, that I actually did in my undergraduate training, we showed a couple of things. We showed that keeping some muscles tight is better for performance, and keeping some muscles loose is better for performance. And we know exactly which ones, okay? Now, the muscles that you want to stretch are just these. If you stretch at all, and I personally don't stretch at all before a race. I stretch after, and I stretch in the days after and during cool down or something like that, but not before a race. You want to stretch your quads and you want to stretch your hamstrings. Now, the reason for this is very simple. Most of the power, the elastic recoil, comes from your foot, it comes from your calf, it comes from your hip. But when we're looking at your quads and your hamstrings, they have more time to contract. They're bigger muscles, they go through a big range of motion, and they're engaged for a long time. So stretching them has less of a detriment. But here's what's really cool is that if you're going to stretch something for injury prevention, the one thing that you want to do is be able to maintain stride. It's called stride angle, but you can think of it as stride length. Now, stride angle is, if my fingers were running here, right, it's the angle between your thigh and your other thigh. That's called stride angle. And the bigger your stride angle, it basically means the faster you're running. When you go faster than at rest, right, you need that stride angle to open up. Otherwise, you're just kind of tiptoeing. And so you want to loosen up those quads and hamstrings to make sure that you're able to maintain that stride angle. But aside from that, you don't want to stretch anything else. Now, the only exception to this is if you have an injury that's existing that is responding well to stretching, in which case I would consider maybe not racing at all, maybe just doing the warm-up and some easy running and kind of taking it easy. But I digress a little bit. If you've been to your doctor or anything like that and you have an injury that responds well to stretching, go ahead and do it. But we're talking about performance here, not dealing with an injury. So I want you to do those two stretches only, keep them very light. And I'm going to give you another hack here, and that is what we called PNF stretching. So there's different ways that you can stretch. One of them is static, which is where you just kind of hold a stretch. One of them is ballistic, where you kind of bounce a little bit, like those butterflies we used to do in gym class and bounce your thighs. And the other one is PNF. Now, static and ballistic have minimal effect, and they could be detrimental. But PNF stretching, on the other hand, is actually really beneficial. Now, I'm going to not break this all down for you, but I'll make it simple, okay? Now, recall right at the beginning of this training, we talked about those muscle spindles, the things that are between the muscle fibers that when you stretch, they kind of contract. So what you can do is you can improve your range of motion up to 30%, which is massive, okay? That means if you can't quite touch your toes, by doing this, boom, you'll be able to touch your toes in one session. And I kid you not, this is very effective. Now, I suggest you do this after you run. But if you are going to stretch, here's a really effective way to do it. And this diagram kind of helps a little bit. You can see that if it's best with a partner, but if you're going to do it by yourself, notice how that towel is around his foot. And you pull your foot up towards you passively. So that's that blue. It says relax. You just relax and you get that stretch for 5, 10, 30 seconds. And then here's the part that makes it PNF is that you then push. You push your heel back towards the ground against resistance. So you're pulling with the towel while pushing into the ground. So it's actually like you're doing some weightlifting almost. And you allow yourself to go through that full range of motion. And when you do that, those muscle spindles, they actually get inhibited. And so instead of contracting, they'll just relax and you'll be able to stretch even more. Does that make sense? Now, keep in mind that doing that before your run very well may impede your performance. So you only want to do this with your hamstrings and your quads, nothing else. And it's best done after or on a recovery day or when you get home later that day or maybe hours before your run, but not right before, okay? So that's all I have to share with you guys about that right now. And remember, your take-home points is warming up is really important. It's correlated very highly with your performance. It will improve your performance. And I suggest this one thing to you if you get nothing else from this other than stretching is kind of not necessary and can be detrimental right before your race. That's one. But if you take something else away from this, I want it to be this here, okay? And that is don't be afraid to do a much more involved warm-up. If you're going to run a 10K, instead of doing 800 meters or a mile of easy running and then maybe some strides, what if you did 2 miles of easy running, 10 strides, another half mile of easy running, and then you did 400 meters at race pace and then walked a little bit, and then did 800 meters at race pace and then walked a little bit, and then just jogged around for the 10 minutes before your race. Well, it's a little scary because you just got in a few miles of running before your race. And you might think that, well, I've got this gas tank and I'm tapping into that gas tank and lowering my energy. And so for the race, I'll have less. And that's not true. The only time that that's true is if you're running a race where you could run out of glycogen, which is only 90 minutes or more. So half marathon, maybe, definitely marathon, you want to be careful there. But with half marathon, 10K, 5K, anything like that, don't worry, you almost can't warm up enough. And the more you warm up and the harder you warm up, the better your performance is going to be. Now, the only catch is that you stop those harder intervals about 10 minutes before the gun goes off. That gives you plenty of time to get enough oxygen, to get some aerobic metabolism, to replace it's called ATP. It's the molecule that gives us energy, that is energy, basically, right? It gives you time to do that. So provided that you stop about 10 minutes before, and when I say stop, I mean stop the hard stuff. Don't stop. You continue to jog. But as long as the hard stuff stops 10 minutes before the gun goes off, then you are golden. And I suggest that you try an extended and a much harder and even faster warm-up. Okay? So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you on our next training.